The universe, for all its infinite vastness and spectacular diversity, has a remarkable talent for producing species that are absolutely terrible at handling mild inconveniences. This is not, strictly speaking, their fault. Evolution, that blind and occasionally drunk architect of biological destiny, tends to favor specialization. If your ancestors spent 40 million years swimming in temperature-controlled oceans or basking under the gentle glow of a perfectly stable yellow sun, your descendants are not going to develop a robust appreciation for weather that can best be described as aggressively indecisive. The Galactic Survey Corps understood this limitation, which is why their standard operating procedure involved extensive climate modeling, redundant environmental controls, and the careful selection of survey teams based on species-appropriate planetary conditions. It was a sensible system, refined over 12,000 years of interstellar expansion, and it had worked beautifully right up until the moment it stopped working entirely. Planet KR-447 had looked promising from orbit. Nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, liquid water, temperate zones spanning 40% of the planetary surface. The initial scans suggested a world of gentle rolling hills, mild seasonal variations, and absolutely nothing that should cause problems for a properly equipped survey team. The initial scans, as it turned out, were catastrophically optimistic. But we shall return to that particular disaster shortly. First, some context about the nature of galactic civilization and its newest, strangest members. The Collective Accord of Spacefaring Peoples, a name chosen by committee and therefore possessed of all the elegance one might expect, comprised some 412 sentient species spread across 9 galactic arms. Most of these species had achieved interstellar capability through the patient accumulation of knowledge over millions of years, their civilizations rising gradually from primitive origins to technological sophistication in environments that encouraged contemplation rather than urgency. By contrast, had gone from banging rocks together to splitting atoms in roughly 15,000 years, which by galactic standards was less a development timeline and more a catastrophic explosion of progress that left other species vaguely concerned about what these newcomers might do next. The prevailing theory among xenosociologists was that humanity's homeworld, a planet they had rather unimaginatively named Earth, was somehow responsible for this unseemly haste. Early surveys of the planet had revealed an environment so consistently hostile that several researchers had initially classified it as uninhabitable, only to be corrected by the embarrassing fact that 8 billion humans were actively inhabiting it at the time. Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, ice ages, and a startling variety of venomous creatures apparently shared this world with the humans, and the humans had responded to this situation not by dying out, but by developing what could only be described as an attitude problem. They adapted. They improvised. They built shelters and tools and technologies specifically designed to spite whatever fresh horror their planet threw at them. And somewhere along the way, they had developed an almost pathological inability to recognize when a situation was supposed to be hopeless. This quality made them simultaneously invaluable and deeply unsettling to their galactic neighbors. The survey team assigned to KR-447 included 2 such humans, a decision that had been made primarily for bureaucratic reasons, involving diversity quotas and interdepartmental politics rather than any particular foresight about their utility. The team's official leader, a Velkorian named Thesik Vor, had accepted their presence with the polite condescension that characterized most interactions between established galactic species and humanity's representatives. Velkorians were amphibious beings whose civilization had flourished in the warm, shallow seas of their homeworld for some 6 million years. They were renowned for their scientific acumen, their philosophical depth, and their absolute inability to function in temperatures below 15 degrees Celsius. HFY-Galactic, like all his kind, possessed smooth blue-green skin that required constant moisture, large eyes adapted for underwater vision, and a core body temperature that dropped dangerously if not carefully maintained. The team's engineer was a Tethrani called Visic Cho, a creature that resembled nothing so much as a praying mantis, designed by someone with strong opinions about geometric precision. The Tethrani had evolved on a world of vast crystalline deserts, where water existed primarily as a theoretical concept. Their exoskeletons were masterpieces of biological engineering, but their delicate wing membranes and joint structures reacted poorly to moisture in any form. Visic Cho had spent the journey to KR 447, reviewing the climate data with what passed for optimism among his kind, the acknowledgement that conditions would probably not immediately kill him. Rounding out the alien contingent was Gromuth, a Korath security specialist, whose species had evolved as apex predators on a high-gravity world of dense forests. The Korath were massive, fur-covered beings with retractable claws and teeth, designed for tearing through prey animals significantly larger than themselves. They were also, somewhat ironically given their fearsome appearance, deeply susceptible to temperature extremes in either direction. Gromuth had been assigned to the mission primarily because his superiors wanted him somewhere else for a while, a common motivation in military postings across all species and civilizations. The two humans had been introduced to the team as mission specialist Kowalczyk and field medic Okonkwo, names that the aliens had immediately decided were too complicated to pronounce correctly, and therefore referred to them simply as the humans in most contexts. This suited both humans perfectly well, as they had long since grown accustomed to being treated as a matched set by species that could not reliably distinguish individual human faces. Kowalczyk was a stocky individual with short-cropped grey hair and the kind of weathered complexion that suggested extensive experience in environments that did not prioritize human comfort. Okonkwo was taller, younger, with dark skin and an expression of perpetual calm that other species sometimes mistook for lack of intelligence rather than its actual source. The profound patience of someone who has learned that panicking rarely improves situations. The team had established their survey station on a broad plateau overlooking a river valley that the initial scans had identified as geologically stable and climatically mild. The station itself was a standard Galactic Survey core prefabricated unit, modular, efficient and designed to maintain comfortable conditions across a reasonable range of external temperatures. The key word in that description, as events would shortly demonstrate, was reasonable. The morning briefing on the team's third-day planetside had proceeded according to established patterns, which is to say that HFY-Galactic had outlined the day's survey objectives while the others listened with varying degrees of attention. The river valley shows promising biodiversity indicators, the Velkorian announced, manipulating a holographic display with webbed fingers. I propose we establish sampling points at these 3 locations along the waterway. Weather projections. Visic Cho asked, his mandibles clicking in the rapid pattern that indicated professional caution. Light precipitation possible in the afternoon hours. Nothing significant. Gromuth snorted, which for a Korath was a sound roughly equivalent to a small engine starting. Precipitation. On my world, water falls from the sky only during the weeping season, and sensible beings remain indoors. Your world also has predators capable of collapsing reinforced bunkers, Kowalczyk observed mildly. Staying indoors seems generally advisable there. The Korath's ears flattened slightly, a sign of annoyance rather than genuine hostility. Your point being, human. No point, just context. HFY raised a webbed hand in the gesture that served as a call for attention among his kind. The precipitation forecast indicates minimal accumulation. We will proceed with the survey as planned. Humans, you will remain at base to monitor equipment and communications. This was not an unusual assignment. Humans were frequently left behind when survey teams ventured into the field, partly because their shorter legs made them slower than most galactic species, and partly because the aliens simply preferred not to have them around during serious scientific work. Kowalczyk and Okonkwo had long since stopped taking offense at this arrangement. Understood, Okonkwo said. We will hold position and maintain the station. See that you do. The aliens departed shortly after, their environmental suits gleaming in the planet's pale morning light. Kowalczyk watched them go from the station's main viewport, then turned to Okonkwo with an expression that conveyed considerable skepticism without requiring words. You saw the actual weather data? Okonkwo asked. I saw it. And the part where the computer admitted its models were unreliable due to insufficient baseline data. I saw that too. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching clouds gather on the distant horizon with a speed that suggested the atmosphere had opinions about the day's planned activities. How long do you give them? Okonkwo asked. 4 hours before they come running back. Maybe 3 if that front moves faster than it looks. Generous. I was thinking 2.5. Kowalczyk shrugged. Could be. Either way, we should probably get ready. For what specifically? Everything, probably. This was, as both humans understood, not pessimism but simply the product of belonging to a species that had learned to expect weather to have a personal vendetta. They began their preparations without further discussion, because some things did not require explanation between people who had grown up on a planet where the sky could turn green and start throwing houses. The survey team returned in 2 hours and 47 minutes, which Okonkwo noted with the quiet satisfaction of a successful prediction. They came stumbling through the station's airlock in a state that could charitably be described as distressed, and more accurately described as absolutely miserable. The HFY's blue-green skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested his internal temperature had dropped significantly below optimal. The HFY's wing membranes were plastered against his thorax, dripping with moisture that his species' biology was absolutely not designed to handle. Gromuth's magnificent fur was matted and sodden, clinging to his massive frame in a way that made him look considerably less intimidating and considerably more like a very large, very unhappy cat that had fallen into a bathtub. What happened? Kowalczyk asked, though the answer was self-evident from the ice crystals forming on their environmental suits. The precipitation, the HFY managed through chattering teeth, or the Velkorian equivalent thereof, a rapid clicking of his feeding tendrils. It is not behaving according to standard parameters. It is falling as liquid but freezing upon contact with surfaces. The HFY added, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone describing a personal betrayal. This is not consistent with any weather pattern in my species' experience. Freezing rain, Okonkwo said. We have that on Earth. Fairly common, actually. The aliens stared at him with expressions that suggested he had just admitted to something profoundly disturbing about his home world, which from their perspective he absolutely had. Your planet has precipitation that freezes upon contact, the HFY asked weakly. And you consider this common? We have precipitation that freezes upon contact, precipitation that falls already frozen in small pieces, precipitation that falls already frozen in large pieces capable of damaging structures, and precipitation that falls already frozen but pretends to be liquid until you try to walk on it. Freezing rain is honestly one of the more manageable options. Gromuth made a sound that might have been a laugh if it were not so clearly involuntary. Your world is a nightmare realm. We prefer to think of it as character building. Further discussion was interrupted by a sound from overhead that none of the aliens could identify, but both humans recognized instantly. The distinctive groan of structural materials under stress they were not designed to handle. "Everyone away from the ceiling panels," Kowalczyk said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who has heard buildings complain before. The warning came approximately 3 seconds before the first leak appeared, a thin stream of water that should not have been able to penetrate the station's sealed construction, but had managed anyway through the simple expedient of finding a joint that had contracted in the cold. 3 more leaks followed in rapid succession. Then the power fluctuated as the heating system attempted to compensate for conditions well outside its operational parameters, and discovered that it was not up to the task. "The environmental controls," Visiksho said, his mandibles clicking in genuine alarm. "They are failing." "They are not failing," the Sikvor corrected, though his voice had taken on a tremor that undermined his authority somewhat. "They are operating within design specifications. The conditions are simply exceeding those specifications. That distinction seems somewhat academic when the temperature is dropping." The Velkorian did not respond, largely because he had begun shivering too violently to form coherent words. His species' cold-blooded physiology, so well suited to the thermal stability of his homeworld's oceans, was proving catastrophically inadequate for a situation where the ambient temperature was dropping toward single digits, and the primary heat source was sputtering like a dying engine. Okonkwo moved to his side without waiting for instructions, guiding the alien toward the center of the room where the leaks had not yet reached. "Core temperature is dropping. We need to warm him up or we are going to have serious problems. The heating system," Visiksho began, "is not going to save him fast enough. The roof is not going to stop leaking on its own. And standing around discussing the situation is not going to make any of those things better." The Tethrani's compound eyes rotated in what might have been surprise or indignation. "What do you propose then?" Okonkwo looked at Kowalczyk. Something passed between them, not words, but the kind of understanding that develops between people who have been in bad situations before, and learned that the path out usually involves doing things that seem inadvisable to outside observers. "I will fix the roof," Kowalczyk said. "The roof is external. The conditions outside are. I know what the conditions are. I grew up somewhere that had conditions like this every winter, sometimes in autumn too, just to keep things interesting." Kowalczyk was already moving toward the storage compartment where the emergency supplies were kept, pulling out items that the aliens had never seen used. Thermal blankets rated for temperatures they had assumed were theoretical, sealant compounds designed for emergency hull repair, and a collection of straps and fasteners whose purpose was not immediately clear. "You cannot seriously intend to go outside," Gromuth said. The Karath's voice had lost its usual bluster, replaced by something that sounded almost like concern. "I seriously intend to fix the roof, so that we do not all freeze to death before morning. Outside is where the roof is. The logic is fairly straightforward, but the cold is unpleasant. I have experienced unpleasant before." Kowalczyk was wrapping thermal blankets around his torso, securing them with cargo straps to create an improvised insulation layer. "The trick is not to think about it too much. Thinking about how cold you are just makes you colder. Very counterproductive." Okonkwo had already turned his attention to the Velkorian, stripping away the alien's soaked environmental suit with an efficiency that suggested considerable practice. "Wet clothing makes hypothermia worse. It has to come off. But my dignity, your dignity will survive. Your core temperature might not. Priorities. Within minutes, the station had transformed from a site of confusion and growing panic into something that more closely resembled a coordinated emergency response. Kowalczyk, wrapped in his improvised cold-weather gear, had climbed through the emergency access hatch onto the roof, where he could be heard through the hull making sounds that suggested strenuous physical effort combined with creative profanity. Okonkwo had organized the interior into zones, a warming area in the center where the Valkyrian was being treated with heated compresses made from reconfigured equipment, a drying station where wet clothing was being spread over surfaces that radiated heat, and a work area where Cho, following instructions that clearly went against every instinct his species possessed, was helping to create additional heating capacity from components that were definitely not designed for this purpose. Gromath stood in the middle of all this activity with the expression of someone who has suddenly realized that everything he thought he knew about a situation was incomplete. "How do you know how to do this?" he asked, watching Okonkwo work. "This is not standard Galactic Survey Corps training. No, this is growing up in a place where power outages during winter storms were normal, where you learn to keep candles and blankets and ways to make heat that did not depend on systems that might fail. Your infrastructure was so unreliable. Our weather was so determined. There is a difference." Okonkwo adjusted the compress on Vor's chest, checking the Valkyrian's vital signs with a scanner modified to account for non-human physiology. "On Earth, we learned that the environment does not care about your plans. You either adapt to what it throws at you, or you do not survive. Simple as that." A thump from above drew everyone's attention to the ceiling, followed by Kowalczyk's voice through the communication system. "First leak sealed, moving to second position." "How is it out there?" Okonkwo asked. "Cold, wet. The ice is building up faster than I expected, but the sealant is holding so far." "Your species," Vor managed, his voice stronger than it had been but still trembling. "You do this routinely. Venture into hostile conditions to make repairs. Someone has to. Cannot exactly wait for the weather to decide to be nicer. It rarely takes the hint." The station shuddered as a gust of wind struck it, but the structure held. Outside, through the viewport, the aliens could see the freezing rain continuing to fall, a curtain of water that turned to ice the moment it touched any surface, coating everything in a crystalline shell that glittered in what remained of the daylight. It was, from a certain perspective, beautiful. It was also, from every practical perspective, trying to kill them. Kowalczyk returned through the access hatch, approximately 40 minutes later, shivering violently, but wearing an expression of satisfaction. Ice had formed on his improvised outer layers, cracking and falling away as he moved, and his exposed skin had turned a concerning shade of red. "Roof is sealed," he reported. "The ice is actually helping now. It is forming a shell over the repairs. Should hold until the storm passes." "You are hypothermic," Okonkwo observed. "Probably, but functional hypothermic. There is a range." "There really is not. There is if you are stubborn enough." Okonkwo did not argue further, simply directing his colleague toward the warming area and beginning the process of getting him out of his ice-crusted gear. The aliens watched this procedure with expressions that mixed disbelief with something that might, in other circumstances, have been called respect. "You went outside in those conditions," Cho said slowly, "knowing that your body would suffer damage, knowing that everyone's body would suffer more damage if I did not. Trade-offs. But the risk was calculated, not eliminated, but calculated. We do not have the option of waiting for perfect conditions, never have really. Our whole evolutionary history is basically one long series of decisions to do dangerous things because the alternative was worse." The station was warming now, The leaks stopped, the modified heating systems working well enough to stabilize the internal temperature. Wet clothing hung from every available surface, steaming gently as it dried. The immediate crisis had passed, though the storm outside showed no signs of abating. It was at this point that Kowalczyk, still shivering but no longer in immediate danger, announced, "Right, now we need food. Hot food." The aliens exchanged glances. "The emergency rations are in storage compartment 4, HFY said. "They are nutritionally complete and require no preparation. Emergency rations are fine for emergencies. This is a recovery situation. Different requirements." I fail to see the distinction. The distinction is that emergency rations taste like compressed disappointment, and what everyone needs right now is something that actually makes you feel like surviving was worth the effort. Kowalczyk was already moving toward the section of the storage area where the humans had stashed their personal supplies, items that had been logged in the official manifest as cultural comfort materials and subsequently ignored by the aliens as irrelevant to mission objectives. What emerged from those containers was a collection of ingredients that meant nothing to the aliens but clearly held significance for the humans: sealed packets of dried vegetables, containers of preserved meat, small jars of substances that Okonkwo identified as spices with a reverence that suggested religious importance, and a battered metal pot that looked like it had survived several previous disasters and was prepared to survive several more. "You brought cooking equipment?" Gromath asked. "To a survey mission. We brought survival equipment. It just happens to also be cooking equipment." Amazing how often those things overlap. What followed was a process that the aliens observed with the same fascination they might have given to an unfamiliar religious ritual, which in a sense it was. The humans worked together with practiced coordination, one preparing ingredients while the other managed heat and water and timing. The pot was filled, heated, adjusted, and tended with an attention to detail that seemed disproportionate to the simple task of making food. The smell that began to fill the station was unlike anything the aliens had encountered in their emergency rations. It was warm, complex, and somehow comforting in a way that transcended species-specific preferences. "What is that?" Visik Cho asked, his mandibles moving in what might have been the Tethrani equivalent of sniffing. "Soup," Okonkwo said simply. "When humans face difficult conditions we make soup. It is one of our oldest traditions, the logic being, hot liquid warms you from the inside. Nutrients restore energy. The process of making and sharing it builds connection and morale. And honestly, after everything that can go wrong has gone wrong, sitting down with a bowl of something hot just makes the universe feel slightly less hostile. This is not a rational response to a survival situation. No, it is a human response to a survival situation. We have found that sometimes the irrational things are what keep you going when the rational calculations say you should have given up." The soup was distributed in whatever containers could serve as bowls, emergency kit components, storage lids, anything that would hold liquid and not burn hands or appendages. The aliens accepted their portions with varying degrees of skepticism. HFY, still recovering but stable, took the first sip with the caution of someone expecting disappointment. His large eyes widened. "This is not unpleasant." "High praise," Kowalczyk said dryly. "I mean," the Velkorian paused, searching for words. "It is warm. Not merely in temperature, but in effect. I do not have a precise term for it." "Comfort," Okonkwo offered. "The word you are looking for is comfort." "Comfort," HFY repeated, as if testing the concept. "Yes, that seems accurate." Gromath had finished his portion, and was looking at his empty container with an expression that suggested he was considering asking for more, but was not certain if that would damage his reputation. On my world, we do not have a tradition like this. When conditions are harsh, we simply endure until they improve. We have that too, but we also discovered that endurance works better when you are not also miserable. The soup does not fix the situation, it just makes the situation more bearable while you wait for it to fix itself. A small distinction. Small distinctions are sometimes the difference between giving up and keeping going. The storm continued through the night, but inside the station, something had shifted. The aliens no longer sat in separate clusters according to species, maintaining the careful distances that galactic protocol suggested. Instead, they had gathered in a loose circle around the improvised heating elements, sharing the warmth and, though none of them would have used the word, the comfort. Questions began to emerge, careful at first, then increasingly direct. Your homeworld, Visic Cho said. The conditions you describe, the freezing precipitation, the storms, the temperature extremes. How did your species survive long enough to develop civilization? Stubbornness mostly. Also fire. Fire was a big one. And tools, Okonkwo added. We could not outrun the predators, so we made weapons. We could not outlast the cold, so we made shelters and clothing. We could not store food in our bodies efficiently, so we invented preservation and storage. Every problem we encountered, we engineered a solution for, Kowalczyk continued. Sometimes the solutions created new problems, and we had to engineer solutions for those too. It is basically our entire history, an endless chain of problems and solutions stretching back to the first human who looked at a sharp rock and thought, I bet I could use this for something. That sounds exhausting, HFY observed. Incredibly. But also, strangely, it is who we are. Take away the problems, and we start inventing new ones just to have something to solve. Not our most endearing quality. Honestly. Morning came grey and cold but calmer, the freezing rain having finally exhausted itself sometime in the small hours. The team emerged from the station to find a world transformed, every surface coated in ice, every piece of equipment left outside encased in a crystalline shell that would take hours to remove. The automated sensors that had been positioned around the survey site were destroyed, their delicate components unable to survive conditions they had never been designed to handle. The aliens' environmental suits, left in the airlock rather than brought inside, had cracked in several places where ice had formed in joints and seams. The station itself, however, stood intact. The improvised repairs to the roof had held. The ice shell that had formed over the sealant had actually strengthened the seal, creating a barrier that would probably outlast the original construction. The mission report, HFY said slowly, surveying the damage, will need to account for these events. Unexpected weather conditions, Visic Cho suggested. Equipment losses due to factors outside normal operational parameters. And the survival of the team. There was a pause. The aliens looked at the humans, who were already beginning to assess what could be salvaged from the frozen equipment with the casual efficiency of people for whom disaster recovery was simply another task to be completed. Unexpected resilience protocols, Gromoth offered finally, implemented by human crew members. That is not a standard classification, but perhaps it should be. The formal report, when it was eventually filed, would use precisely that language. It would note that the human crew members had demonstrated adaptive responses to environmental extremes beyond standard mission parameters, and recommend that future mixed-species survey teams include human personnel as a matter of policy rather than bureaucratic obligation. It would not mention the soup. Some things, the aliens had decided, were difficult to explain in official documentation. How did you describe in formal language the experience of huddling together in a damaged station while a storm tried to kill you? Eating hot liquid from improvised containers while two members of the galaxy's newest spacefaring species calmly discussed their homeworld's attempts to murder their ancestors. How did you capture the moment when you realized that the beings you had dismissed as primitive were actually the products of an environment so hostile that it had forged them into something remarkable? You did not, really. You simply noted unexpected resilience protocols and hoped that someone reading the report would understand what that actually meant. The galaxy, it turned out, had been exploring the stars for 12,000 years. Humans had been part of that exploration for less than 2 centuries. And yet, somehow, when the freezing rain came and the systems failed and everything that could go wrong did, it was the newcomers who knew what to do. Not because they were superior, not because they were more advanced, simply because they came from a world that had spent millions of years trying to kill them, and they had responded to that situation by learning how to stay warm, stay dry, and make soup. In the grand cosmic scale of things, these were small skills. But sometimes, the universe has a way of reminding even its most sophisticated inhabitants that the small skills are the ones that matter most.